Please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Please welcome back today's Master of Ceremonies, Doug Shoup.
Welcome back, everybody, to day 2 of our first ever virtual summit. What an incredible lineup of breakout sessions we've had yesterday and this morning. I think you'll agree that hearing from the chairs of our agencies, our millennials and Zoomers, contractors, and many more, the speakers and topics have been just outstanding. Thank you again to today's titanium sponsor, Parsons. We would like to also thank this afternoon's exclusive closing session sponsor, HNTB. Thank you, HNTB, for making this program session possible. Just in case you were wondering, winners of the Easter eggs on each floor of the virtual expo will win prizes ranging from Amazon gift cards to a grand prize of Apple products valued at $1,000. Also, if you have found a golden ticket in your bento box, please know that you will be the recipient of a marvelous prize: 2 free Disneyland Park tickets and 2021 Summit and VIP registrations. Now, there are 10 golden tickets to be found, and at the end of the closing session, I will draw the name for our grand prize: 4 free Disneyland Park tickets and a basket of Disney-themed goodies. So please stay tuned until the very end. And now, for our final discussion, I would like to introduce a representative from our underwriting sponsor, Parsons. Here to present our closing session moderator is Lisa Morath, Parsons infrastructure leader for Southern California and longtime Mobility 21 advisory board member.
Good morning, everyone. 2020 has been a challenging and a tragic year. However, I'm hopeful that our transportation community can come together to identify opportunities and a path forward. I'm very honored to introduce the moderator of our final discussion on equity and recovery. Charles T. Brown, MPA, is one of our nation's leading voices in transportation equity and justice. He is a senior researcher with the Alan M. Voorhees Transportation Center, an adjunct professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, both at Rutgers University. He also serves as a 2020 fellow within the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication in partnership with the Op-Ed Project. With more than 15 years of public and private sector, military, and academic experience, he has gained international attention for helping to create safe, healthy, and livable communities. So please help me welcome Charles Brown as we begin our closing session on equity and recovery in discussion with our Southern California Transportation Agency CEOs.
When history records the crises and trials of 2020, our descendants will look to our response to these challenges. Countries around the world and in our communities in Southern California are directly experiencing the simultaneous consequences of a global pandemic and long-standing racial injustice. Transportation agencies' services and their impact on our economy and mobility in this raw, chaotic, and evolving environment have never been more important. This panel includes the leading transportation executives of Southern California, who will share how they are dealing with the intertwined issues of equity and recovery during the ongoing emergency and throughout the coming year. Panel participants include Kome Ajizi, Mark Baza, Hassan Ikrada, Daryl Johnson, Darren Kettle, Ann Mayer, Phil Washington, Stephanie Wiggins, and Dr. Raymond Wolf. Why focus on racial equity and justice within transportation and mobility? As one of the nation's top experts in transportation and justice, I've chosen to prioritize the race conversation in transportation and mobility in order to broaden the narrative of transportation planning. I am strongly committed to leading and centering race in all transportation decision-making processes because too often race is glazed over in planning, research, and policy development that makes assumptions about the communities we're tasked to serve. Instead, proxies such as income, age, sex, gender, education, and access to vehicles are often used as an alternative to avoid centering race-based issues. The history of structural racism, the policies, institutional practices, and social norms that together maintain racial hierarchies, and its impact across the country and within communities is often overlooked and unacknowledged. Yet it is pervasive and unmistakably harmful to everyone. The social marginalization and inequities that racism cultivates in housing, education, employment, the built environment, and social environments, and healthcare are felt across generations, but most acutely among Black, Indigenous people of color. Because of this, I recognize that systems of cultural oppression and racism need to be acknowledged and be repaired by entities that helped create them. As professionals, we have a professional and moral obligation to acknowledge that the uneven development of cities and the resulting racial and health disparities are the result of systemic racism ingrained within the planning profession, as well as engineering, real estate, and etc. What is equity? Equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. Equity is the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Facing equity, however, requires an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society. It also requires a consideration of additional social identities such as gender, sexual orientation, physical abilities or qualities, religious beliefs, etc. It is also because transportation has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within society. This is most evident through highway robbery, where in city after city, highways that were built to appease white suburban commuters and enabled through eminent domain and funds from the 1949 Housing Act and 1956 Interstate Highway Act were shoved through these areas, causing blight and pollution. For more local examples, you might recall I-215, San Bernardino's Berlin Wall, or I-10, Redlands in San Bernardino County. These examples, along with racial residential segregation, have unfortunately led to disproportionate amounts of pedestrian injuries among older adults, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities, as well as climate impacts and California becoming one of America's most dangerous states for pedestrians. So how do we create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all? First, in pursuit of distributive justice, we must ensure that everyone has access, and keep in mind that there is no access without safety. Second, in pursuit of procedural justice, we must ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in the progress as well as in the design, operation, and programming of our systems. Thirdly, we must ensure that all people feel welcome in our spaces. Lastly, we must ensure that people feel their experience and history is represented in our public spaces, and we must demonstrate our care for the space and people who live in it. I'll pause now for Mobility 21's Black Lives Matter statement. The Black Lives Matter statement is a very powerful statement at a very unique time in our history. First, what would each of you like to say to the thousands of people you represent and serve in Southern California, along with the others throughout the state and nation who are grieving and demanding justice with the families of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless other victims of racial injustice in California and throughout the US.
Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for having me on. I can tell you the killing of George Floyd and the unjust killing of Black people at the hands of police or vigilant white people over just the last 6 months hit me hard as a person. We all are on a journey in life to learn things, but this one was really very telling for me. And understanding that racial justice has everything to do with land use and transportation decisions. I believe we as CEOs hold positions that could make a huge impact on this issue. And this issue is such a significant issue for me that when you are called the leader and you lead many people and you're responsible for big investments and you could make impact on policies, if you don't take that responsibility seriously, for me, it means that I'm not doing my job. So for me, it hit me hard to the point where I'm going to stand up for what's right. I'm not going to look at this whether it's politically correct or not. This is unjust. And I'm in a position to make an impact, whether it's in my field or other fields, and I'm going to take big advantage of it. You know, oftentimes we say, oh, we understand. This has to be more than that. This has to be, we not only understand, we're going to change it. It's unjust, period, end of discussion. And it's discriminatory at its worst. So that's how I feel when I look at that.
Thank you, Hassan. Others?
Yes, it's Phil Washington. You know, the statement means a lot to me because I think that to understand that Black Lives Matter, one has to understand that there was a time when Black lives did not matter, constitutionally even. And it was taught in this country, you know, years ago, that Black lives did not matter. And so when I see that statement, it's incredibly personal to me as a Black man with a Black son who's a young man. And so when I look at that, the significance of that statement is very real. Now, I don't know who came up with the title for the movement, Black Lives Matter, but it seems to me to be incredibly relevant, and it seems to me to mean a great deal because of the things that I just mentioned. When the Founding Fathers was thinking and writing about freedom in the run-up to the Constitution, you know, Blacks at that time, slaves, I believe, were incredibly hopeful. I mean, because they actually thought that applied to them, you know, and you know, leading up into the Civil War, you know, Blacks at that time, slaves, really thought that the winning of the Civil War, you know, they knew the emancipation was involved in the Civil War, so freedom was there, but they thought they would be treated like, you know, a man or a woman. And so when we look at the Black Lives Matter statement, that statement, I think we all have to understand and try to put ourselves in that situation or in the mindset of a Black man to understand that at one time, constitutionally, Black lives did not matter. We were literally 3/5 of a human. And we have to understand that. So it's incredibly important, that statement to me. And I think when we look at that statement, we have to think about the historical perspective of it.
Bill, it's my understanding that you've had some lived experiences with racism in this country. You mind following that up by sharing some of those experiences and why this resonates even more with you personally?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. I think first, you know, I'll say I grew up, you know, on the south side of Chicago in the era of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Black boy who lived in the city of Chicago, who went down south to visit his cousins, and a white woman said he whistled at her. He was drugged from his cousin's house at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was beaten and killed. Now, his mother was up in Chicago, and by the way, she just passed away recently, and we knew her. She went to, our church. Now, this was in 1955. I wasn't born yet, but we grew up with that Emmett Till story, where his mother insisted on bringing his body up and having an open casket, where the people in the South wanted him to just be buried, and not because his killing was so grotesque. And so when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, my mother and my sisters, we were on our way home from church on a Sunday night. It was about 9 p.m. And my mother, my single mother who worked 12 to 14 hours a day, decided to take us to White Castles there in Chicago. Those of you from Chicago know White Castles. And me and my mother went into White Castles. Maybe she sent me in there by myself. I can't remember. Went into White Castles, got whatever we were going to buy, and got back in the car, continued out south to our public housing complex on the south side of Chicago. Got to our house, all of us got out of the car, my sisters, my mom, and me. I'm an only son, so I was the only male there. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 squad cars just pulled up, guns drawn. And they were calling me by another name. They were calling me Donald Hobson. Hobson, get down. I'm like, oh, what's happening? And my mother got out of the car, came around, she was driving, came around to the passenger side, stepped in front of the police and me, and said to the police, his name is not Hobson, his name is Philip Washington. And incredibly, I was talking to my sister about this about a month or 2 ago, and she told me I was carrying some pots and pans from the car for some reason. Now, this makes this even more dangerous because it would have looked like a weapon. I didn't remember that, but she told me that. So my mother jumped in. She said, his name is not Donald Hobson, it's Philip Washington. Now, the backstory of this is that Donald Hobson had just robbed a store of some kind, probably the night before. I found this out later, and they thought I was him. And I thought to myself, these police officers, I really believe that they would have killed me that night without even asking me my name. And had my mother not been there, I probably would have done something stupid like run or something, and they would have killed me. And so this is the perspective that I come with as it relates to the recent George Floyd killing, the various other killings, and I'm sure other Black men have similar experiences and have this type of perspective with the police. And it was and is a lived experience that I think about quite often, because undoubtedly there probably would have been a different story had they killed me. I probably would have been Philip Hobson Washington or something, where, it would have been a whole completely different story. So I think when I see the killings of Black men in police custody, and I think about why a Black man is twice as likely to die at the hands of the police than a white man, I really think and I understand how relevant the statement Black Lives Matter really is.
Thank you for sharing that, Phil. Others?
I think when I think about the statement that Mobility 21 put out, but also the fact that Black Lives Matter and we have to actually say it that simply, is really, really important. And it's important because of the historical context that's already been shared here this morning. And for me, the fact that all of this happened at a time when so many of us were feeling really raw anyway because of what was happening with COVID and everything else, I actually think for me that it gave me the ability to see it pretty clearly. And I think the Mobility 21 statement for me, it's very emotional. It's personal, but it's also really liberating. And what I mean by liberating is that it gives us the ability to have a conversation, because, you know, so often in what we do, we're all public servants here. We work for public agencies. We've been working for a long time, and we have our public personas, and we talk about policy, and we talk about all sorts of things. And oftentimes we forget that everything we do is about people. And it's people that we're supposed to serve. And so for me, it's liberating because I feel refocused in why I'm doing the job I'm doing. Along with the emotions of anger and fear and everything else, it's also, there's hope. Back to what Phil has talked about. We all need hope. And I think that's the significance of the Mobility 21 statement to me, is that we're using our collective voices to not just talk about what's important in our profession, but to talk about what's important to us as people.
I've been an active member of Mobility 21 since 2010, and I've been proud to be part of that. But I have not been prouder to be a part of an organization and leadership group with these folks here that said something about Black Lives Matter. And so I can't say enough about how proud I am to be a part of this organization and the sentiment that we brought forward to you all as the public and our peers and colleagues. This is personal for me as well. I grew up in a neighborhood that was largely African American and Mexican American, and I saw firsthand disparate treatment as I was growing up as a young man in the 70s. As a young boy, I saw what was happening in the 60s, as my brothers were much older than I, and they were activists in their own rights, and they actively were fighting for the rights of what ended up being the Civil Rights Act, as well as all of the other things that are important to equality for people. I saw firsthand how people of color and particularly African Americans getting disparately treated or physically treated differently than others, that just for a simple pullover for a traffic violation. These are things that bother you when you're growing up, and you try to accept it, but you can't. And we have, just as Ann said, we have been in careers of public service, and we have been afforded the opportunity to provide for those who can't provide for themselves, and we take that very seriously. I know every one of these people, they feel that way. They don't do this just because it's their job. They do it because they treat all people equally, and try to provide services to those in need. And that's one part of the reason why I'm proud to be associated with these folks in this panel, and because I know that is the way they all look at these things, and the way I look at things. We've all had, long careers, and we've had opportunities to improve communities of color and communities of low income, and to be able to do those things and to provide services for all. That's very rewarding. I can't say it all in one sentence, but it's very rewarding.
Certainly following Phil's comments, that is a very tough act to follow, and jumping in right after that took some real courage, but she's spot on. One of the things that Hassan led with is the fact that while we're transportation leaders in Southern California, it's by extension we're leaders in general to the public we serve. And so the best way I can answer the question about what does Black Lives Matter statement mean to you is just by way of a quick example. I participate in on an advisory board for one of our local universities' economic programs, and they were getting ready to do a conference. And one of the key elements of the conference was going to be the presentation of an economic forecast for Latinos. And some of the members of our advisory board commented about, well, you know, we're right in the middle of Black Lives Matter. Maybe we should do also a Brown Lives Matter. And it was at that point where I said, we're in a moment. This is a moment. I don't think we water down the moment that Black Lives Matter means. And yeah, lives matter. Right. But in this moment, Black Lives Matter. And I don't think we want to dilute that. And I was on this panel with this advisory board. I don't know, there were probably 30 people that were on the Zoom talking about how we were going to put on this conference. And so there was a little bit of chatter back and forth afterwards. And ultimately, I think that the sense was maybe now is not the time to be talking about how we would try to combine that conversation. And what happened for me, though, the next day is I got an email from an older member of our community who I think might have been thinking a different way the day before. And he said, Darren, I'd never thought about it like that. You gave me something to think about that wasn't where I was. And I just wanted to say thank you for that opportunity to give it a little bit more thought. So in our role as transportation leaders, in our role as public leaders, there are going to be those uncomfortable places where we have to stand up for, in my mind, that when the time is right to do the right thing. That was one instance. I would love to say that happens to me every day. It doesn't. But it was that one opportunity. I think it actually, it had at least an impact on one member of our community in Ventura County.
Thank you. Comey?
Hey, Charles. Thank you. It's really good to be here, and I really appreciated the comments so far. You know, you mentioned earlier on about this professional and moral obligation that we have to deal with this. Talking about race has always been a very difficult subject in just about every setting. It's been so difficult that oftentimes we walk away from it. And we've walked away from so many opportunities to be able to talk about race. And I agree with Darren, this is a moment that we cannot afford to walk away from. I think the statement basically helps make a clear, it provides clarity on a professional basis for all of our organizations that we do in fact agree that Black Lives Matter, and that we have taken it upon ourselves to make that uncomfortable conversation more commonplace, because that's what this needs, is to make it more commonplace such that we can have a reckoning about race and on a very honest level. And for all of our organizations, as it's been spoken to, we have some role in affecting people. This is what we do, the work we do is about people. And so that obligation that we have professionally, I think, has been captured and we provided, and this statement has sort of provided that for us. But on a personal basis, and you know, whether you're a Black person or not, just the humanity of what we've seen with the killings of, you know, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, you know, just the pantheon of names, the unfortunate pantheon of names that we now are so familiar with. I think the humanity of it has to touch one. And I have a 31-year-old son, and we've had the conversation that everybody talks about. You know, you have to moderate your life with the things that you've seen, having been followed by squad cars in my neighborhood and told to go home. You know, you have to have those conversations with your 31-year-old that things, you know, they own the place. And I have to, you know, I have to tell you, when he had to drive from Chicago to Philadelphia about 2 months ago, as a young folks would do, he didn't start the trip early. It's a long trip. It's about a 12-hour trip. And we had agreed when we talked to him that you're going to start driving around 6 a.m. so that you can get to Philadelphia when it's still reasonably sane. Well, he got into Philadelphia at 3 a.m. We were up with him. And he, you know, his mom and I were talking about this. Why did we have to stay up with him? Well, I think that goes without saying. We could not understand why he would do that in the first place, but we also were afraid for him. I mean, we were literally afraid for him. He was driving a U-Haul truck, moving from Chicago to Philadelphia, driving at midnight, and didn't get into Philadelphia until 3 a.m. The thought that goes through a parent's mind when you have a Black son or a Black child, or a person of color, or families of color, these are the things that we're dealing with on a personal basis that hopefully we wouldn't have to deal with if we had this clear reckoning on race. And so I think having this conversation is an important one. It's one that we are duty bound to provide space for, such that we can then begin to deal with the issues that are systemic about this. Because ultimately, it's about what we can do or what we can enable others to do to fix the systemic issue of racism that we have, the social injustices that we see around us. I think we have an obligation as organizations that are around the issues of dealing with people and helping people to be able to face it head on and hopefully bring some resolution of some sort in our lifetime, so that our children and our grandchildren will not have to deal with this.
So a couple of things, maybe listening to all of my colleagues that I work with on many different things. I want to first thank Phil for sharing your story, Kome for sharing your story, and then Ann for reminding us that what we do here is about people. And when I think about the Mobility 21 statement on Black Lives Matter, I think about people. And I got into transportation nearly 30 years ago, not because I was an engineer or a planner, but I wanted to make our communities and our cities better. And what I didn't know 30 years ago, obviously I know a lot more about the issues of our history today. And I think as a county, as a region, as an individual, I think it's important that we acknowledge and raise the questions and the challenges around the sort of history of racial injustice and social equity, not just across the nation, but here in our region in Southern California, and we can't ignore those. And I think the opportunity that we're presented with today is a forum to make progress, not only as individuals, but for our institutions and the people we represent and the people that we lead. And if we can't show leadership, if we can't show strong-willed decision-making in times of toughness, then we can't expect the people that we are responsible for leading to follow suit. And we know there's no question that the transportation sector can't solve the issues of social injustice and racial inequity, but at the same time, we can be a big part of the future. And I think if we focus on our future, that's where we can do the best job we can. And so when I think about the people, as Ann indicated, we shouldn't be thinking about bridges. We shouldn't be thinking about buses or trains. We should be thinking about transportation as an essential component to making sure every person has access to these really important things around education, around meaningful employment, around quality healthcare. And if there's one thing that has sort of come to my mind during this last 6 months, during the pandemic, that I think ties right into the Mobility 21 statement on Black Lives Matter, is that we have a critical role. And I'm just going to talk about public transportation for a moment, but it's more important and more apparent than ever before that we have essential workers that are relying on us to get to work to make essential trips. In Orange County, during the worst days of the pandemic, we still had nearly 30,000 people a day riding the bus system. And when I thought about those 30,000 people a day, I thought about people that had no other choice. They had to get where they were going. And many of those people were riding buses in the disadvantaged parts of our communities, and that was an essential service. They didn't want to be out there. They had to be out there. And that's a big part of what I think we do in transportation, is making sure that we have a lifeline to our communities. We keep our communities running. And again, just sort of closing with what I started with, is this is about people. It's how we deal with people. It's not about bridges. It's not about roads. It's not about freeways. It's not about rail lines. It's about people. And if we can't deal with projects and programs and services that serve people, all people, then we're not doing our job right. So thanks for the opportunity, Charles.
Charles, I just want to just add one thing. And again, I'm really grateful for Mobility 21, for Jenny and Kristen to do this. And I appreciate Phil's and Comey's personal stories. Oftentimes we heard in the past when these things, when a black man get killed or murdered in front of our eyes on camera, you often hear the argument, oh, this is a bad apple and the rest of them are good. So happened in the killing of George Floyd, there were 4. And it's not one bad apple. And this statement that Mobility 20 said, enough is enough of that BS. Let us just call it what it is. It is racial injustice at its worst. Black people getting killed in the hand of white people. And I will share with you just how important this statement is. I met with my Black American employees here at Sandag. And, I'm on a journey to learn myself. And I asked them, what's the hardest thing? And every single one of them, especially mothers, said that the hardest thing for them is to sit with their young kids and try to explain to them why they, like Comey said, why they shouldn't be at this hour of time. If that doesn't get to you, I don't know what. So I'm proud of the statement. I'm proud of Mobility 21. I think enough is enough, and we need to call it what it is. As uncomfortable as it is, we must have that discussion. We should have had it a long time ago, but I appreciate Phil's and Comey's personal stories and my colleagues chiming on the discussion.
First, for those grieving and demanding justice, I say I hear you and I'm with you. I would also like to say to the people I represent and serve what I shared with my employees, and that is that this is really about the basic struggle that we were all in, the struggle to be fully human and to see that others are fully human. Desmond Tutu said, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Watching George Floyd's torture and murder for me, it woke most of America up. And I realized that I need to not just look at the perpetrators, but really look at the system that enabled it. Racism is not an event, it's a structure. And if we truly believe that everyone, all humans are created equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. And simply put, we have to look at the role that policy plays in systemic racism. So when I think about the Mobility 21 statement, I want to ensure that it is transformative and we really take action. I think it's very important that we acknowledge the role that transportation infrastructure and our systems, the role they play in perpetuating systemic racism. And then I'm proud of Mobility 21 for not only acknowledging it, but then stating that we're committed to transform the way we all do business in transportation to help close the gap of racial inequality and to better serve our communities of color. I think that's critically important because it says Mobility 21 is not going to be standing on the sidelines. And that's incredibly important to me.
Mobility 21 statement regarding Black Lives Matter was a critical first step, recognizing the seriousness of the issue. Tragically, our society has not yet evolved to the point that we desire. Black lives do matter. Human life matters. Justice is foundational to a society's continued existence, and we should demand such. It is sad that we have to make such a statement today, but we must, and we are. From a professional perspective, we can make a difference in the projects and the priorities that we advance. The decisions that we make will have a profound impact on society. And this is why I'm so active in Mobility 21. Collectively, the leadership on this panel, coupled with all of our Mobility 21 partners, are focused on what is right for Southern California. Daryl said it best. We must lead towards a better future. We must work tirelessly to better serve the region without bias or prejudice. Our staff, the people we serve, are watching and ultimately will emulate our actions. I have complete faith in Mobility 21 as an organization, as a collective of people who intend to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you all for answering that question. Very, very much appreciated. Now I want to talk about facing uncomfortable truths about systemic racism within transportation. As you all know, more and more light is being shed on the role and impact of systemic racism within and on transportation and mobility. First, are there any new truths about systemic racism within transportation and mobility that you've discovered? If so, please share, but also touch on if and how this new information or reality may have caused you to change course, either personally, professionally, or both.
Thank you, Charles. Without getting into history and how transportation practices in the past actually were in the middle of being unjust itself by splitting communities, and depending whether these communities are rich or poor, or we have Black American or Hispanic American or minority communities. As an adjunct professor for a few years, I taught the inequity in transportation, and around the country we had many examples. Let's not get into that. The question is, and we as leaders should set the tone and be held responsible for action moving forward. One, to undo the injustice of the past, and two, to make sure that, like I think Daryl and others of my colleagues said, we must ensure access to all people, regardless of their color, ethnic background, or income. And so, I right now, the CEO of a metropolitan planning organization and a regional transportation agency that build project for San Diego County. Has the second largest city in California and second largest county in California. And the question is, how did we do in the recent past when it comes to transportation? And you can see clearly that we focus very heavily on how to give access to people who make a lot of money and who are mostly white. That is the truth. And I can tell you that if I were to go and make that statement in front of my board, they probably add to their long list of things they need to fire me for. But that is the truth. And moving forward, I feel very strongly with my team, I have a responsibility to say, wait a minute, we're just about to put forth a new investment plan. We're about to go to the voters and ask for more money. So we have control over what kind of projects we need to build in San Diego County, not only to overcome the injustice of the past, but also to provide the access to people that needs it most. Daryl mentioned it. Black American, Hispanic American in San Diego County are 4 to 10 times, depending on the area, are more likely to be impacted by COVID-19 because they're from the first to be out to go to work to save the rest of us. And some of them have very limited access to transportation options. Actually, we still have about 100,000 riders that get into the transportation system, not because they want to expose themselves, but because they have no other choice. That's what we need to focus on. And you know, it came in a debate in our board meeting. We can never have social equity in transportation unless we figure out the pricing mechanisms that been in the past and continue to be today. People say, oh my God, we're subsidizing transit riders. Think again. we're actually subsidizing the personal vehicle much more than anything, and we can mathematically prove that. So I believe, without getting into too much of the past, we have an opportunity as leaders. Not only we're leading many employees, but we're also building many projects, billions of dollars worth of projects, to make sure access to opportunities for all. And like Anne said in the beginning, this is about people. And as I said in the beginning, this is a personal journey for me. And I'm willing to take it because it's standing for what's right.
Tragically, I believe we still have a ways to go to truly stamp out systemic racism in transportation. Many of the communities directly impacted by transportation facilities are disadvantaged, as we've already heard. Let me provide an example. California's #1 priority transportation project, the California High-Speed Rail, is clearing environmentally the segment from LA Union Station to Anaheim. And as they advance that project, rather than purchasing the necessary right-of-way to allow for the electrified high-speed train operation in conjunction with other existing freight and passenger rail, they have opted instead to environmentally, as part of the project, environmentally clear a new intermodal facility in Colton, California. So effectively what they're looking at doing is pushing freight into a severely disadvantaged community. The communities in Grand Terrace and Colton, San Bernardino, and Rialto, and Bloomington are rated by the state's own Cal Enviro screen in the top 80th percentile of disadvantaged communities. And in fact, 3 of the communities surrounding the proposed intermodal facility in Colton are in the top 95th percentile. And so here we have a real life example of a project that the state of California is advancing that continues the disparity that we are trying to resolve today. We have to do better. We can do better.
Thank you. Coleman?
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I think your question was, is there new truths that we have just come upon that we want to share? I would submit that I don't know that we have new truths. I think what we have is we've always known these things. I think what we have is a sunshine on the truth and a spotlight on the truth in ways that is compelling that we cannot, hopefully we cannot look away. We've always known the statistics about the disparities between people of color and white population. We've always known disparities on income, education, and health. I think COVID-19 was probably more of the sunshine, where it showed very starkly who's been impacted are the frontline folks who are predominantly people of color. And so the issue is really not about new truths, it's about what do we do with the truth that we've always had. And for us at SCAG, being a metropolitan planning organization, we don't deliver projects, but we could do better. Because I think it was Stephanie that talked about this notion of systemic racism is something that has to be systemically done away with. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen by accident. And so we have to go into a process of being able to identify what the systemic racism issues are. And some of that is the data that we have at the MPO level, for example. How do we use that? How do we make sure that data gets to inform decisions in ways that can alter the trajectory of the systemic racism that we have in place? And so, yeah, I just wanted to quickly chime in on that it's not so much, at least from my perspective, that we have new truth, is really doing better with what we have and trying to fix the issues with the information we already have at hand.
I appreciate that. Anne, then Phil.
I think Kome really hit upon something that resonates with me, and that I don't see any new truths here. What I see is that I am more able to connect the dots between the inequities in transportation policy with those related to housing and zoning and in access to jobs. And the question that we should be talking about is, all right, how did we get here? But what are we going to do about it? And it's easy when there are policy conversations that are blatant in what their impact might be. There's a lot of those, but I think the challenge for all of us is, how do we look at policies and their nuanced implications? How do we ensure that we're connecting the dots? So if there's new land use policy being made, what does that do in terms of racial and social justice? And I think all of the touchstone policies that were important before that created this inequity, mobility, jobs, housing, land use, climate change, these are all policy conversations we're having again. And we need to make sure that we just don't continue with creating this kind of racial injustice with policies that are softer and kinder and gentler, and they seem fuzzier, and they seem like they're really, really, progressive, but in fact, all they're doing is still perpetuating the history that got us to where we are today. And I think that's an area where I feel like I need to commit more time to make sure that I'm looking at those policies and that I speak out about what they will do to our communities of color and to our communities with who live in poverty.
Thank you, Ann. Phil?
Yes, I agree with what Ann just said, and Comey. I think that this is a true test of our leadership as an organization, where we see these inequities and where we see these things that Ray Wolf mentioned. Do we speak up as an organization or not? Because the combined voices that we have in a forum like Mobility 21 is powerful. It's very powerful. And so that's the first thought that I have. The true test, it's a true test of our leadership when we see these things to speak up. The other thing I think about in listening to the conversation is I was sitting here thinking about, when did I begin to feel the caste system? When did I begin to feel like our community, or me as a Black man, was somehow inferior? And I mean, these things are conditioned in people of color. And in listening to the conversation, great conversation, because I think all of us are of like minds on this call, and we have many other people of like minds. But I was sitting here thinking about this because the caste system, CASTE, that system is so ingrained that our skin color, when we walk in a room, speaks before we do. And the same thing goes with the communities we represent. And so I think the industry, the infrastructure industry here lately, has made a very deliberate statement. And that statement is, we will connect communities. Now, that is a powerful statement, because transportation infrastructure has been used to divide communities for so long, whether it's highways or parks or whatever. Swimming pools, my God, Black folks can't swim in the same pool. I mean, infrastructure of all types, whether it's transportation infrastructure, social infrastructure, or whatever. So we have made in our industry a very deliberate statement that we will connect communities. Now, we cannot, I think, make that a throwaway statement. We cannot make that an irrelevant statement. We've got to be real to that statement, to say, wait a minute, this particular project is actually dividing communities, so we're going to take a stand against it. And so people, I think, I hear people talk about this all the time, all over the country. We're going to connect communities. Oh yeah, And it doesn't mean anything because in some cases, we're still allowing things like what Ray mentioned to take place and exist. And so I think if we are serious about connecting communities, which we've been saying all over this country, that's like the new buzzword, then how can we step into the leadership void of gentrification? How can we step into the leadership void of all of these things that we are involved with in the transportation industry?
Let's move on to addressing public skepticism and mistrust. As Stephanie stated earlier, you want to make sure you're not just being performative, right? And there are many who will and who currently are skeptical of your new so-called commitment to racial justice, equity, and inclusion in transportation mobility. They'll say, and many have already exclaimed, that you're just being opportunistic, given recent protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the current climate, particularly calls for racial equity and mobility. I would like to very quickly, as quick as you can, hear from each of you. How would you like to respond to these critiques and criticisms?
I understand the skepticism and mistrust. Systemic racism is insidious, it's adaptive, and it's difficult to eradicate. We have developed euphemisms so that polite company doesn't have to confront our history of racial exclusion. My whole career has been met with microaggressions where we're conditioned to be silent. So I understand the concerns, but this time I think it's different. There are markers that a real transformation is beginning. There are institutions that are speaking up, corporations are speaking up. We have voices that are multi-generational, multi-ethnic, and they're united in really saying that Black Lives Matter and that racial inequality needs to end. So I think the key is to hold us accountable in all aspects. I know personally as a leader, I have made a commitment to seek out and identify and call out any instances of microaggression, any instances of racial inequality, because it's time for this to change.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. And I think the skepticism is rightly placed because the history would suggest that when these things typically happen, we grieve for a little bit, we're anguished for a little bit, and then we move on. I think there's a school of thought that would suggest that, maybe because we're all locked down is why we were forced to focus this time around. There are no NBA games, no playoffs. Now, all of those distractions that we typically have are not there. So maybe that's why we're so focused on it this time around. And that would soon pass once we get past the pandemic. So yeah, it's a very healthy skepticism that should be held. And I think for us, we have to be held accountable. And what you're seeing, what you're hearing, hopefully in the last few minutes of this conversation, is us being accountable and holding ourselves accountable for this moment, as it's been called. And one way to do that is to begin to institutionalize this thought process in our practices, in our processes, such that when those projects do come up that call for that, that tough decision that could change the direction of equity, that we can make those boldly and with courage. To be able to have that courage, I think, would stem from how much work we do in building the institutions at this point. At SCAG, we had the board adopt a resolution on social equity. What that resolution seeks to do ultimately is to call us out and publicly basically put us out there to say we have now stood out, we're standing out, and we're going to be standing up for social equity and racial equity. And so as we begin to run our programs, we have the conscience of that board resolution to guide and make sure we're doing the right thing. And so I think that's one expression of how we would be looking to institutionalize it. We're also looking to have a social equity committee that's going to be made up of folks outside of SCAG plus some of our policy members to have this public conversation. And again, so because what we've figured out is this is not going to be a 1 year thing. It is going to be a forever thing in our lives, basically, as we continue. But have this public conversation about social equity. Have others define it. Have others, point at us and say, what are you doing in this area? And continue that process. I think it's time for just wholesale discomfort to keep moving this forward, such that we can then get comfortable in being bold to do the right thing. I think it was Hassan that talked about that disparity in cost between investing in transportation that favors the disadvantaged and what favors those that are advantaged. We tend to bring up things like return on investment and all of these things when we talk about transit, for example, when in fact those who are using transit, they have to. And so we have to be able to provide that to them. And we shouldn't be counting that cost to the extent that we're trying to provide access, equal access to opportunities such as jobs and health and education and recreation too. We should be able to then be able to count those as part of the elements of why we favor those projects over other projects. So I think it's a moment that calls for courage, and we only get that courage by making sure we begin to institutionalize this thought process in our processes.
A little while ago, Ray referred to Bloomington and Fontana and Rialto as some of the most economically disadvantaged parts of our state. And I grew up in Bloomington in the 70s and 80s, and I can tell you that it didn't get that way overnight. 35, 40 years ago, it was on its way to what it is today. And the reason I mention that is that these challenges we're facing didn't happen overnight. And the way we're going to fix it is not going to happen overnight. But more importantly, these challenges were purposeful in many instances, and we have to be purposeful about how we're going to fix them going forward. So I think Stephanie mentioned it, and I think Kome mentioned it. We have to be held accountable, but we can't solve this overnight. We can't take a 50-year or a 60-year challenge, or maybe longer, and fix it in 1 year, or fix it in 15 days, or fix it in one STIP cycle or one MPO planning cycle. But we do have to ask our constituents, our members, our board, all of ourselves, to hold us accountable to make the right decisions. And we should feel compelled when we make these decisions. We should ask ourselves, are we making the right decision for the long term for the right reasons? And we could spend all day talking about these things, but I think it's very important to remember we cannot solve things that took many, many years. We can't fix those in many, many days, but we have to be purposeful about it, and we have to hold ourselves accountable.
Thank you. Let's move now to Mark, then Hassan, then Phil, quickly.
Yeah, I've just echo some of the things that have been shared as far as procedures, et cetera, looking at our communities in detail as for any type of project, whether it's a simple transit service project or a highway interchange or a freeway widening or a new freeway. We all have to look at what do those impacts mean to the communities that we serve. But what we can do, and I probably have a little bit easier because is to get the message to our team that is our planning staff, as well as our bus operators, all the way down to dispatchers, is to make sure that they are treating all of our community equally and that they understand the benefits of what we are providing our community. That we are for my county, all of the transit riders are all they need to use transit to get to their doctor's appointments. Even some folks to get from Imperial County to San Diego County for medical services. So we are providing services, and that my team understands what we are doing for our communities. And, you know, like I said, I do have a little bit easier because I don't have as many employees as most of you do. But getting that message across to our team that what we do is so important to so many.
I'll do very quick. I think people have every right to be skeptical, because if you judge us by our past, our grade will be really very low. And because we tend to always react, not be proactive. I hope people are not gonna just what we said today, all of us, but what we're gonna do in our plans and our investments and our programs. And I can tell you that short of me going and having our policy board act on something significant towards social justice, I will consider myself a failure, and I would consider people being skeptical is correct, and they should be. But like I think Phil mentioned, we hold important position, not only for transportation, but we can influence other investment. I will share you one thing. I spoke to my 400 employees here at one time about this issue. And the next day I get a caution from some people says, well, be careful about talking about racial injustice too much, because some white people feel like you've been shaming them. Now, at least the mere fact that you're starting this conversation, and like Comey said, this time it's real. It's not just a one-time thing. It is time right now to be people to judge us for what we do, what action, what investments we make, and what tough policy we recommend to our board. And if we don't do that, that means we're not doing what we're supposed to do.
Skepticism, yes. And yeah, I mean, that does not surprise me. I think the first thing we can do, should do, is in our own organizations. We should look at our promotions. We should look at the salaries. We should look at the diversity of our teams. These are things that we can do right now. When you talk about skepticism, people in your own organizations are not going to believe you if you do not rectify the issues within your own organization. Every year I ask for a report from HR. I want to know, is there discrepancies in pay for people of color, for females, whatever category it is. If they're doing the same job, relatively same amount of experience or whatever, I want to rectify that. And every year there's some names on that list that we have to fix. Every single year with some type of salary adjustment that we have to do. So I think we should, yes, there's planning for projects and all those things, but we should start within our own house, which becomes in our respective houses / our organizations, because we can fix those things relatively quick. And even our organizations, our employees will know we're serious. And trust me, that word gets around. Hey, you know what? The boss asked for that report. They're about to fix this. They begin to believe. And so the skepticism disintegrates within your organization, and then we can work out.
Thank you all. So if we were in person right now, I would say we're going to do this rapid fire. We're going to do this rapid fire virtually, which means that I want you to give me your answer as best as you can within 30 seconds so we can get to the final two. I want to now transition to envisioning the recovery through the lens of equity and racial justice. Given our discussion here today, and I'm going to start with Ann, so I'll repeat the question. Given our discussion here today, as well as the current climate, I cannot imagine anyone envisioning a full recovery that doesn't center racial justice and equity. With that in mind, specifically equity, what will recovery look like in each of your areas? We're going to start with Ann, and we're going to quickly go around the room. I'll type your name into the chat below. Ann?
I think in terms of recovery, first we need to acknowledge that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the health, lives, job security, housing security, future future security education. So we need to acknowledge that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the economy. In Riverside County, where we're just now recovering from the Depression in the late 2000s, this is going to be a really serious conversation. And I think for us, it's going to be about how do we make sure we help people get back to work as quickly as possible, because a job is the key to security in every other area. And how do we address the fact that long commutes is one of the single biggest contributors to job insecurity? And so for us, from the perspective of equity, we have to make sure that investments are made in communities where transportation is the impediment to people getting back to work. And I think for us, the key to economic security, and I see the leadership in Riverside County from elected officials, there's a commitment there to protect their residents, to protect their communities. I think the challenge for us is to make sure that policies are not imposed on a one-size-fits-all across the state of California that creates and in fact fosters additional inequity. Because I think we're about to head in that direction with policies that will be very, very detrimental. So for us, it's going to be about a focus on recovery, a focus on protecting the most vulnerable communities and making sure they don't fall through the cracks.
Well, I've been doing a lot of reading and soul searching lately. And I think it's critically important that as we look at recovery and racial justice and social equity being at the center of that recovery, I first think internally. I think I have to, as the leader, provide an opportunity to ensure that my leadership team is educated about racial biases. And because I believe that racial bias really, it starts there, and it's a very difficult conversation to have because it's not easily understandable. And so implicit bias training is fundamental internally, starting with my leadership team and then expanding out to all of my employees. Really moving forward to learn and grow, because I think as the employees learn about this issue, it will help as we look at the service that we provide and planning for the service and how we restore that service. Externally, I think it's really important to ensure that we are providing a service that is affordable and accessible to everyone. I've learned so much from the essential workers who are still writing our service, even during the stay-at-home orders. I learned that most of them identify as essential workers, over 71%. They're more Black and brown writers. The writers who are still writing have lower incomes. And that typically is not the demographic profile for commuter rail. So when I think about the benefit of commuter rail, our writers are traveling long distances. It really is an opportunity for them to get home ownership and have more affordable housing. It's really critically important that as we come out of this recovery, we look at incorporating elements of equity to ensure that these opportunities are available to everyone. So as part of our recovery plan, we have a specific equity element. We're looking at affordability. We're looking at our service to ensure that our trains are not just operating through these communities, but they're actually serving these communities as well.
Thank you, Charles. Leadership in San Bernardino County is very serious about addressing equity issues, both internal to our processes, as Phil mentioned, as well as external. Our Board of Supervisors, in concert with the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, adopted a county-wide vision in 2011, nearly 10 years ago. The focus of this vision was addressing impediments to community growth for all communities in San Bernardino County. The Board of Supervisors just added an element to add additional focus to racism to the countywide vision. The San Bernardino County Transportation Authority Board just formed an ad hoc committee to look at our processes internally for determining project priorities and preferred alignments as viewed through the lens of equity, something new for us. Given the fact that the The San Bernardino County Transportation Authority also serves as the County Council of Governments. We have wide-reaching ability to affect true change, working with key stakeholders across the county. I'm confident that we will succeed.
Two things. I think it's going to be a matter of access. In Ventura County, we already, we're as a very suburban, in many ways rural portion of Southern California, our issues are going to be a little bit different than the more urban areas. We still have access issues. I think that's going to be the biggest thing towards economic recovery, and how we focus on those parts of our community that have had limited access. Sadly, we don't have the level of transit service in our county that some of our neighbors do. It's a question of resources, and I will not get up on that soapbox today. But nonetheless, that's a challenge. I think the other part, though, is parochialism. And that's something, sadly, that is all too clear in my county, where the question of money isn't a matter of where should it go to make sure we have the best access. It's, well, that money's mine and I don't want it to go someplace else. And we have that in our county. And until we bust down those walls of parochialism in my county, and arguably throughout the region, but certainly in Ventura County, we are not going to be able to provide the level of access that gets economic recovery to those that have really been challenged through the pandemic and our other challenges.
Sure. So thanks, Charles. So the COVID-19 basically puts this in focus, that to recover from this economic downturn, we have to, especially to make it sustainable, we have to make sure that it centers around equity and inclusion. I think data shows that to the extent that we have inclusion, we actually grow our GDP by 4 to 5% by making sure everybody is included. And so that's one of the things that we've done, is we've undermined ourselves with social inequities and economic inequities in some way. What I want to focus on is the fact, and why this is important, is the fact that with the pandemic, 60% of the jobs that were lost immediately at the onset of the pandemic were of the 5 lowest wage categories. And so those are folks that are hurting the most right now. And so for us to build back inclusively, we have to look at those jobs that in our region are mostly in entertainment, in tourism, and hospitality. Those are folks that are mostly impacted, and we have to make sure that what we're doing to bring them back is important. I think from our perspective at SCAG, we have to take another look at how we score grants and competitive programs that we're involved with. Oftentimes, we've done equity from the basis of geography, where we have this geographic equity. We haven't really looked at the fact that we have 62% of the state's disadvantaged population in our region, and how we set in our programs to focus on that large population of disadvantaged folks, which may not be geographic in terms of balance. And so thinking through how we restructure our programs as part of the recovery, I think is going to be important as well.
Yeah, I think 2 things. One is something we had already been working on before COVID-19, and that is creating and applying an equity assessment tool to all projects and programs. That's number one. The second is we have the highest percentage of low-income riders in this country on LA Metro. And so I don't expect for everybody to even attempt this, but that is a fareless transit system that I have already introduced. Now, when you talk about skepticism that we were talking about in the previous question, there's already people that think this is some sort of diversion that I'm using because we are cutting back service or something. It's crazy. But a fareless transit system is, in my view, can be done. It is a matter of priorities of the governing body. And I'm calling it to question right now with a task force that is doing research around this issue. And I'm going to bring it to my board the end of this year for a decision. Now, if that is not equity in the most diverse county in the country with the highest percentage of ridership, I don't know what is. And so, yes, we are using the COVID-19 crisis as one reason, and it falls under, Chicago's former mayor, never let a crisis go to waste. But this is something that I think when you talk about the sort of what recovery looks like, a fairless system, transit system has to be at the top of that list.
When we looked at transportation planning in the past, up to now, we have requirements, federal and state requirements to look at equity. And we usually check the box, yeah, we met that. We really didn't truly understand what that means, but yet we met it. We have the criteria, we have the numbers, we get the federal and state funding, we move on. I think equity and building in what Phil just said has to be assessed as a criteria and beyond who benefits and who pays and what's the greenhouse gas emission benefit. Social equity for every project, as far as I'm concerned, need to be met before you start that project, and we should be judged on that. That's one. Number two, and I really appreciate what Phil trying to do with Metro about fairless transit. I can tell you this is very uncomfortable discussion, especially here in San Diego County. But at Sandag, people still tell me, well, you're subsidizing you're spending half of your Transnet sales tax on subsidizing transit. And reminding people, if I were to get into that mode of calculating who's getting subsidized what, I think we're subsidizing the automobile by many, many times over. So I could see a fairless transit system be a logical argument to make if you want to have an equitable transportation system. So all of our region, I know in San Diego, there will not be any added general purpose lane to any freeway. Instead, we're gonna make some, and we're gonna take shoulder and make them priced lanes. And part of that pricing strategy, we have to discuss a fairless transit system, whether you like it or not. So we're actually tangibly gonna be able in this regional transportation plan to make equity a criteria that's not just check the box, but truly a social equity in transportation. And two, the pricing has to get into the mix because people have a misperception about who subsidizes what in transportation. And I'm hoping that my board would have fun debating these things, but I will keep discussing them until they kick me out of town, which could be very shortly or, it doesn't matter. The point here is, I really do believe, to go back to my statement in the beginning, we have a responsibility as CEOs, not only in transportation, but we should expand that to be the broadband and the Wi-Fi and the digital access. And we should be able to discuss with our colleagues from the private and public sector how we can get equity into all of these things. Kwame and I has been discussing digital divide. I mean, most of our kids right now are learning online. 30% of the kids don't have the broadband or the Wi-Fi. What do we do with that? So that my point is, let us take this seriously to the point where we can do tangible things for the people we serve.
Well, I was loving what Phil was saying about his future fairless opportunities. And to that end, my team was able to get a small grant, and we are currently offering free fares to all of our riders right now, at least for as long as the money lasts. And we're hopeful that it lasts into at least the end of the fiscal year. So I'm definitely cheering from the sideline about how you accomplish that, and maybe we can build off of that goal. Because as you all know, these are the people that need these services more than you and I do, and they need to get to work. And this is going to be that much more important as the economy starts to build up again. And the other side, earlier Hassan talked about, other opportunities that we we need to be involved in, and we have opportunities to do that. Broadband is one of those areas that I've been partnering with our economic development organization and finding the disparities of our disadvantaged communities and our outlying. For a large county as ours, we have a lot of rural areas that we have limited broadband access, and we need to provide access to those communities, to those kids who go home. They may have broadband or network access at school, but when they go home, they need to have a computer that has access to the internet. And other economic development opportunities that help serve our communities better is all in all of our best interests for the people that we serve.
Thanks, Charles. I'll make it quick. 3 things I'd like to point out. First and foremost, I think if we define recovery as what the society we live in here in Southern California looked like on or around March 10th, I think we're missing the point. I don't think it will return to that point. And secondly, I don't think it should. In fact, if we haven't learned something through the global pandemic and the issues and challenges brought to light through the issues of racial injustice and social equity, we're missing an opportunity. Recovery has to work for everyone, and it can't just work for a few. And the third piece is specifically to OCTA. I think this gives us a real opportunity to see very clearly where the demand for our transit system is. We've tried to make some big changes in recent years, and we've been partially successful. I've always wanted to push harder on that, and I think this gives us a real opportunity. And if we do it within this lens of where we've been over the last 185 days or so, it gives us a real opportunity to look forward. And again, we can't look backwards. We have to look forward. We have to learn from what we just came through.
It's very hard to predict the future, as you all know. However, I believe in your individual and collective psychic abilities, particularly in the realm of transportation and mobility. If you could only choose one word to describe the future as you see it now, what word is it and why? And I'm going to press you all. Mark, don't include these comments in the recording. We'll go back and capture them. But I want each of you to give me one word and briefly state why. Briefly as in 30 seconds or less to close out. Stephanie?
Anti-racist. That's my word. An anti-racist confronts racial inequities. And in the transportation and mobility realm, this is needed so much to overcome disparities in home ownership, clean air, and congestion relief. So anti-racist is my word.
Imminent. The future is here. The challenges are right in front of us, and we have to step up to the plate and take some action.
United is what I suggest. We need to return to the United States of America. We need to have our communities work united together against this pandemic, this racism. We need to change the thought process, this vigilantism. We need leadership that takes us there.
Bright is the word. I think the future is bright because I believe the last few months have waken us up as leaders to stand for what's right. So I look for a bright future where we undo the injustices of the past and we make social equity an important component of our daily planning and building of transportation projects.
Collaborative. We have to continue to expand the way in which we reach out, how we take input, and how we incorporate feedback into our policy and our project decision making. We have to listen, we have to understand, and we have to respond to our communities of color, those who are economically disadvantaged, and those who have disabilities or other challenges to mobility. And we have to continue to seek out partnerships on all levels, not just a local level, but on all levels to ensure that transportation is never a barrier to the future of equality here in the United States.
The word that comes to mind is duty, and it comes from what you had said in your opening, Charles, that notion of a professional moral obligation that we have. We have a duty to meet this moment that we're in and to not squander the opportunity. I like the idea of don't let a crisis go to waste, but it's just, I think the premise that we would have to explain this time to our children and grandkids in the future as to what we did, I think is one that sort of motivates and if not even scares one on a daily basis to that extent. So I think this moment calls for duty.
My word is impartial. We're in the business of creating mobility. Mobility is gender neutral, race neutral. In fact, it does not include any qualifiers. It simply speaks to the ability of a society to prosper economically and socially through connectivity, nothing more.
I guess I'd have to say hope, or hopeful, maybe. It's this has been a fabulous conversation, and the last person we're going to hear from is Phil Washington, and we can't let this moment go to waste, and we can't let this moment be a moment. It has got to be lasting. I'm hopeful that we can make that happen. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. There are going to be a lot of competing interests, but with the collective knowledge and fortitude that is in this group and with our elected leaders, I'd like to think that we're up to that task.
Yeah, hopeful as well. Hopeful because I believe in the humanity of mankind. I really do. And I think that good will overcome evil. And that sounds hokey, but I believe it does. And so I am hopeful because I think people will win out, love will win out, and that is contingent, however, also on leadership in this country and in the world, because it's going to be tough to break down the caste system that serves as the nuts and bolts of the proverbial house. This has been a foundation in this country for years. It's going to be tough to break it down, but I'm hopeful that we can do it, and I'm hopeful because of everybody on this call.
Thank you very much. I would like to reiterate what I said earlier, and that's that when history records the crises and trials of 2020, our descendants will look to our response to these challenges and more. I would like to thank each of you personally for taking time with us here today. You are an inspiring and amazing group of professionals. For you, as well as those who have participated with us today, I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. It reads, "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public." My name is Charles T. Brown, and that concludes today's closing session. Be well, everyone.
Thank you to our Southern California agency CEOs and Charles Brown for your thoughtful discussion. What an honor to hear from each of you. The rest of the country has all eyes on California and our transportation agency CEOs. Thank you for being our trailblazers. Thank you again to Charles Brown, Kome Ajise, Mark Baza, Hassan Ikrada, Daryl Johnson, Darren Kettle, Ann Mayer, Phil Washington, Stephanie Wiggins, and Dr. Ray Wolf. After this session, please note that the Expo Hall and Hospitality Suite will be open until noon. Networking in the Hospitality Suite with all conference attendees and small group FaceTime with our regional executives will continue until noon today. So please head there right after this raffle to enjoy your networking benefit. And now for the Summit Raffle, we will have one prize winner. We have randomly selected one Summit registrant, and the number is 699. Urol Yal of Flatiron. You are the lucky winner of 4 Disneyland theme park tickets and a basket of Disney-themed prizes. Once we all make a safe return, we hope that you and your family enjoy this grand prize at the beautiful and fun Disneyland Park. In the meantime, please enjoy your Disney goodies. Lastly, we would like to thank our Easter egg sponsors, Advantech, Autodesk Construction Cloud, EXP, First Class Connection, Image Active Photography, Kempton Strategies, Kleinfelder, Mark Thomas, Parikh, Port of Long Beach, Rail Pros, and the Southern California Partnership for Jobs. What a wonderful 2 days at Mobility 21. It was so great to see each and every one of you. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors for their tremendous support. Thank you to our elected leaders for championing transportation. Thank you to the Mobility 21 Board of Directors and the planning team for hosting an incredible virtual summit. This was a unique setting for unprecedented times we are living in, and we are fortunate you participated and had the opportunity to reconnect and learn. And to all of our members, you are the reason why our coalition is so strong, cohesive, and a force to be reckoned with. Thank you, and see you in the Expo Hall and Hospitality Suite for our final networking and FaceTime.